Welcome back. Today we're diving into a political analysis that asks a pretty provocative question, one that's right there in its title. Israel, a threat to global peace. Our job is to break down the specific argument made in this analysis, step by step, to see exactly how it arrives at its conclusions. So this is the central question posed by the source material. Now, to be clear, our goal here isn't to take a side, but to actually deconstruct the argument itself. We're going to look at the evidence it presents and the logic it uses to connect all the pieces. So here's how we're going to break it all down. We'll start with the central claim the analysis makes. Then we'll dig into the three main pillars it builds its case on: issues of land and international law, its regional military posture, and, of course, the nuclear factor. And finally, we'll see how it all leads to a very specific call for accountability. Okay, so what's the core assertion here? Well, the entire analysis really hinges on the idea that the world is already in a pretty tense and fragile state, and it argues that certain policies are acting as a major source of global instability. The source really sets the stage by saying, look, the world is already on edge, and within that context, it makes the case that specific Israeli policies aren't just local or regional issues anymore. It frames them as a major source of instability that actually threatens peace on a global scale. All right, let's get into the first major pillar of this argument. This one is all about the long-standing Israeli-Palestinian conflict and, crucially, its relationship with international law. The analysis zeroes in on three key actions that it says are fundamental to its argument. First, what it calls the continuous expansion of settlements in the West Bank. Second, the restriction of movement in Gaza. And third, the constant tensions bubbling up around Jerusalem's holy sites, which are often a flashpoint for conflict. And here's where the source really connects the dots. It argues these aren't just localized disputes. It claims they're actually violations of international law, and that they have this ripple effect, fueling wider regional resentment and actively working against any real shot at a lasting peace. Okay, so for the second pillar, the argument kind of zooms out. It moves from the immediate conflict to look at Israel's broader foreign and military policy across the entire Middle East. So what exactly does the source mean when it uses a term like an aggressive posture? Well, it points to two very specific behaviors: conducting military strikes in neighboring countries without, it says, authorization, and making consistent public threats against its regional rivals. The analysis claims these actions really define its approach to foreign policy. And the big so what here, according to this analysis, is the constant danger of escalation. The source argues this posture creates a highly volatile environment, a tinderbox, really, where even a small conflict could easily spiral into something much, much bigger, potentially dragging in global superpowers. The next pillar of the argument deals with a topic that is just huge in terms of strategic importance. We're talking about nuclear weapons. Now, before we see the source's argument, it's really important to understand this key term: nuclear ambiguity. Basically, it's a government policy where a country doesn't officially say, yes, we have nukes, but it doesn't deny it either. It's a strategic position designed to create uncertainty. So, according to this analysis, this policy of ambiguity has three major destabilizing effects. First, it creates a massive power imbalance in the region. Second, it could actually fuel a new arms race, pushing other countries to develop their own nuclear programs. And third, it undermines global efforts to stop the spread of these weapons in the first place. All right, so we've seen the three main pillars. How does the source tie all of this together? Well, the final section of the analysis synthesizes these 3 points to reach its conclusion and make a very specific call to action. So the argument's logic pretty much flows like this. It claims that policies suppressing human rights, when combined with an aggressive military posture, lead directly to broad regional destabilization. It's the combination of these three things that forms the core of its whole thesis. The analysis wraps up with this really powerful statement, which kind of serves as the philosophical core of its entire argument. It basically says that any security built on what it calls occupation or oppression is just not sustainable. True security, it argues, can only come from justice and a real commitment to peace. And that leads to the source material's final recommendation. It's a call for the international community to apply the same standards of international law and human rights to every nation, with no exceptions. The main principle it's pushing for is universal accountability. And that really leaves us with a huge question to think about, one that stems directly from the source's conclusion. In a world full of competing interests, How do we find the right balance between one nation's security needs and the collective goal of global peace? That's the challenge this analysis leaves us all to consider.